Okay, maybe we can slowly start. I'm sure people will still join us and come in. But I want to wish you a good afternoon. Good afternoon to many of you. Good morning and good evening to some of you. My name is Sarah Brakke and I hold the chair in Sociology of Gender and Sexuality at the University of Amsterdam. And I'm the director of the Amsterdam Research Center for Gender and Sexuality, together with Julie McBrien, who is the vice director. And we are really pleased to welcome you all here today. Our distinguished guest, who will offer us a lecture, Professor Tithi Bhattacharya, whom I will introduce more elaborately in a moment, and our esteemed colleague, Dr. Marguerite van den Berg, who will give a response, and I will also introduce her later on. And welcome to all of you in the audience. In these digitally mediated gatherings, we don't really get to see each other. We miss your faces. We miss feeling your real life presence, but we are very happy that you were able to join us today. And I think at the moment there's 65 of us, I think, and maybe some more people will join. And let me just perhaps add, I did receive messages from colleagues that they would have loved to join, but that this time in Amsterdam is for many the time to fetch children and cook for children and bathe children and slowly put children to bed. And I just wanted to say, we see you. All of us who are speaking here today had to think about solutions for many of those things to make sure that the children in our care are being taken care of right now. So there is, as per usual, other labor happening to make sure that we can have this gathering and this conversation, including, by the way, also technical support and technical labor. So we hope that some of you might still be able to listen in while you are doing some of that labor. And otherwise, if all goes well, you will have the opportunity to watch the recording. Today's event is recorded, so also keep that in mind in the audience, that you know that this is recorded if you want to ask a question, and that you will be able to watch the recording in your own time. The link will be posted to the RGS website soon. So before I now go on to introduce what we will do today, let me just say a few words about RGS. Our center seeks to foster and consolidate a community of scholars and scholarship on gender and sexuality within the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research. Now, this is a community shaped by many differences in disciplinary context, in theoretical and epistemological approaches, different methodologies, and also differences in the emphasis on gender and or sexuality in one's research. And we are really committed to make this an as expansive community as possible, where such differences are welcomed and provide fertile ground for new conversations and new ways of thinking. So check our website for the kinds of events that we organize. Also check our PhD community, which is a thriving community, and join the newsletter to stay up to date. The webinar today is the opening event for the research community at large here at the ASSR. We've already had an opening event last week for the student community, and this morning our PhD community had their first event. But so this is our opening event, and in a year that stands out in many respects, and not only obviously because of the pandemic conditions about which we will talk later on, but also, and I just want to mention this because as RGS this year, we celebrate our 10th anniversary as a center. And let me just share a little story about that, which will then lead us into the topic of today. We wanted to organize a conference for 10 years of RGS. And as we began planning that conference last year, the first idea or working title that we came up with was The End of the World, and gender and sexuality at the end of the world. And then came the pandemic and we had to cancel the end of the world. And clearly in the meantime, we've been thinking more about this, and clearly our initial idea was not focused enough, perhaps. It didn't yet put the finger at the pulse, the end of the world. But in the meantime, we have it more clear what we want and need to be doing in our capacity as a research center. We want to be thinking through crises. and engage with those bodies of scholarship that help us think through what to many in the world today does feel like the end of their world, with worlds and livelihoods crumbling. And so this brings me to the work of Professor Tithi Bhattacharya and the sharp and rigorous and insightful ways in which that this work thinks through many crises: the crisis of care, the crisis of work, the crisis of the political economy of capitalism. And it is very appropriate and a great honor that she opens our webinar series of Thinking Through the Crises. Let me briefly introduce Professor Bhattacharya. She is a professor of South Asian history and the director of global studies at Purdue University. She's the author of The Sentinels of Culture, Class, Education, and Colonial Intellectual in Bengal, published by Oxford University Press. She writes extensively on Marxist theory, gender, politics of Islamophobia. She's widely published. She's on the editorial board of several journals. And if I got this right, she just founded or maybe co-founded a new journal called Spectre. She's involved in various national and international struggles. And we also understand that you've been speaking at conferences of professional associations of nurses, who of course have been on the forefront of the crisis of care and of the healthcare crisis of healthcare systems this year. And I personally also really look forward to hearing something about that. And in the past years, she's been a key reference with the rise of social reproduction theory. I have the volume here on my desk, always close. This is an edited volume from 2017 about, and social reproduction theory, something about which we will hear more in a moment. Tithi Bhattacharya has prepared a set of insights and reflections for us on the crisis of social reproductive work, particularly in the light of the COVID-19 conditions. She will share this lecture for about 20 minutes, more or less. And then we will have a response by Dr. Marguerite from den Berg, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Amsterdam and Director of our Master Program in Sociology and Board Member of ArcGS. Marguerite's work is very much situated at the intersection of gender, labor, and social welfare. It's widely published in journals such as Gender, Place and Culture, Work, Employment and Society. And Marguerite was also one of the first ones to respond publicly here in the Netherlands when, after the lockdown in March, there was a scramble for academics to be recognized as essential workers by the Association of Universities in the Netherlands, which would imply that academics would be able to be productive through having access to the special and limited provisions for childcare and school for vital workers. And we do know stories about frontline healthcare workers not being able to take up those needed childcare spaces and days because academics were vital workers taking up some of those spaces. So as that was going on, Marguerite van den Berg was one of the first ones to question that publicly, question the notion of what is essential work in these conditions, and also who gets to define it, with what stakes. The stakes felt like business as usual in this case, productivity. And so all of these critical questions. Marguerite's response will be about 10-15 minutes, Marguerite. And then we will slowly move into conversation. I am guessing first between the panelists, because I'm sure there's questions and back and forth between our two speakers. And then I will also open it up for Q&A with you, the audience. There's a Q&A button, if all goes well, if all is well, at the bottom of your Zoom interface. And we will ask you when I open Q&A to type in your question there, and I will read out your question, but I will come back to the logistics of this when we actually get into the Q&A. We will wrap up this conversation latest at 7 p.m. Amsterdam time, so we have kind of an hour and a half. And that is pretty much it from me today. So it is now with great pleasure that I give the floor to Tithi Bhattacharya.
Well, Thank you so much, Sarah, for that generous introduction. Thank you to Marguerite and Julie and Robbie for holding space in these very, very difficult and challenging times. I want to start by acknowledging how I understand how hard it has been for all of you, not just as organizers, but all of you who are listening in, to make time for seminars such as this, to make time for thinking through some of the politics of this, right? Because our time has been so much taken up with just trying to get through the day, to combine our waged work with our unwaged work, no matter what your family situation has been. So I really want to acknowledge and thank you for taking the time to come to spaces like this and discuss this. And I'm so much looking forward to and learning from your experience and your questions. So I'll start with when we discuss this with Sarah and Julie and Marguerite, I think one of the starting points for us to think about was the definition or the very category of essential work, because we've heard that term bandied about so much in recent times. And often that term and the kind of work it encompasses has referred to work that we as feminists have tried to highlight. So suddenly we find that governments and governmental agencies, not known for being the greatest of feminists, are suddenly using that term and drawing attention to that kind of work. So this is why I thought that, you know, it would be interesting to start with that category and try to interrogate it and try to find out who is saying this is essential work, what does it mean, and how do we as feminists view essential work? So Julie, if you don't mind, I'd like to share the first slide. And thank you so much for doing that. Right. So this is, I hope you can all see it. So in my state, the governor delivered this list of what is essential work. And this was at the start of the pandemic, you know, just at the start of the lockdown in my state. And most of the states in the United States followed a similar kind of list, if you like. So you will see, if you go through this list, you will see the kind of work that is listed here. And I just want to draw attention because I am recalcitrant that way, that you do see, you know, right here, I don't know if you can see, financial and insurance institutions, banks, credit unions, etc. Now, this was, I just want to make clear that it wasn't saying banks were essential services. It was saying it in the context that ordinary people needed access to these institutions in order to go to the grocery store or, you know, buy petrol or what have you. So just to make it clear. So if you look through this list and similar lists in the various countries right after lockdown started, you will find that there are no stockbrokers, no captains of industry on this list. All we have is workers, workers, and more workers. The pandemic, albeit temporarily, albeit momentarily, actually turned the capitalist world the right side up, moving from the bottom of the social ladder all those skills and jobs that are necessary for the reproduction of life and society. So today, I want to talk about three things briefly. What is essential work? Who does this work? And why capitalism normally devalues and invisibilizes this work. So essential work is something that I have called life-making work. So what is life making exactly? One way that I've tried to get at the question, or try to answer that question, is via the category of labor power, or the capacity of human beings to work or labor. So capitalism, as I understand this, is a system which unites two kinds of social processes. One is the production of commodities or things, you know, all your different brands of toothpaste, all your coffee, and all your useless products that capitalism churns out on a daily basis, all your plastic. And the other is, besides the production of commodities, it is the production of workers who produce these commodities, right? So we have the twin processes of thing making and life making, okay? I want to begin talking about the relationship between these two processes with a quote from Aurora Ozanik, who is this excellent commentator on these two processes. She is the 5-year-old daughter of a nurse and a construction worker in Pittsburgh. And she makes sense of her parents' jobs in this way. Mommy fixes people, she said, and daddy fixes things, which I thought was a perfect way for her mind to understand thing making and life making. But workers are produced in a double sense, through biological reproduction by people who give birth, and as bearers of labor power. And it's where the bearers of labor power that we have to kind of look through a little carefully, because the process, you know, the birthing of a people, of a whole generation of workers happens in, and the first years of care usually happens inside the home. But the kind of resources we can give a child is not enough for the child to actually grow up and be a worker. So this is why the child, as they grow up, need access to healthcare, to schools, to public parks, to various institutions, in order ultimately to become a citizen of whatever society they are living in. So, so they're reproduced in this double sense, one in the initial moment of birth, and then in what I call spaces of life making, right? So schools, hospitals, these are all spaces of life making where the child develops as a human, an adult human being. So the worker then does not arrive at the doors of capital ready to produce commodities. The worker and her labor power have to be constantly made and remade for such a purpose. So food, shelter, schools, social housing, water are all vital or essential, if we want to use that word, ingredients for the production of this labor power of the person, right? But before we go any further, I want to make clear here, even though we're using the category worker and so on, that this is not just about wages, okay? Because access to these resources of life making are not just mediated by exploitative economic relations between workers and capitalists, right? It is also crucially mediated by multiple relations of social oppression as well. So this differential access shapes a working class that must struggle to overcome the tensions. And I'll give you two very simple examples from the US. Black communities in the US bear a disproportionate burden of the nation's pollution. Think about the poisonous water in Flint, Michigan. In 2017, an NAACP report showed that African Americans were 75% more likely than other Americans to live in areas situated near facilities that produce hazardous waste. Similarly, in the 1930s in America, federal officials in Richmond, Virginia, amongst other multiple cities, redlined Black neighborhoods as risky investments. Those very neighborhoods today are the hottest parts of Richmond, with barely any trees and an abundance of concrete pavements that trap heat. Okay, so the spaces of life making and the politics that and the decisions that go into constructing these spaces of life making are also not neutral spaces. You know, that these spaces themselves have an archaeology of denial and oppression sort of built into them as to how these life-making spaces are made. And that in turn assures the differential access that different parts of the working class have to these spaces of life-making. So the social capacities with which we make life and the institutions with which we maintain life and satisfy our needs have always been undervalued by capitalism. This is why life-making services such as health, education, and public transport always receive less funding than defense and crime, and are always the first to be privatized or underfunded. Even food production under capitalism is conducted strictly on the basis of profit margins rather than hungry humans. As life-making work is devalued by capitalism, so are workers who perform these tasks. Nurses, teachers, home care workers, farm workers, cleaners, without whose work it would be impossible to maintain life, are those very people who are paid the lowest wages and have the worst work conditions. A pandemic then tragically clarified both the importance of life-making work and the perils of devaluing it. Who then are the essential workers? Who performs these essential tasks that reproduce society and sustains life? From the grocery store clerk to the emergency room nurse, from the childcare aide to the agricultural worker in the field, it is most likely a woman. In the US, 1 in 3 jobs held by women has been designated as essential. Non-white women are more likely to be doing essential jobs than anyone else. The work they do, as we know, is often underpaid, unpaid, and definitely undervalued. They are an invisible labor force that has kept the country running both before and during and soon after the pandemic. In these extraordinary times then, how do you think we will fare without a banker? And now think, how would we fare without a nurse or someone who stocks the shelves in our supermarket? The pandemic has shown us in very clear terms what feminists and activists have always known: the importance of care work and life-making work for the sustenance of life and society. For the first time in decades, we saw governments take unusual measures to actually institutionalize this insight that feminists have always held. They opened more hospitals, albeit makeshift. They suspended the making of things that are unnecessary for life, and they dispersed funds to help out families in need. It is not unfair to compare these government measures, and many mainstream commentators have done so, to measures taken during war times. But when the crisis passes, we should be, as feminists and activists, prepared to wage just such a battle against our rulers and the system they protect. We cannot go back to the old normal of mindlessly churning the wheels of commerce solely for the sake of profit and devastating our planet in the process. A new way of organizing society nourished by the priorities of life-making must become our new normal. We're not going to burn the planet if we build more schools and more hospitals instead of building more airstrips and more Boeing airplanes. So my proposal for us, perhaps, to sort of discuss is the governments have presented us with a very skeletal understanding of essential work. And I think it is a very functional and skeletal understanding of what essential work is and who does it. It's something they have slapped together in order to tide over the pandemic. So our job is to take that category of essential work and yoke it to this deeper feminist understanding we have of life-making work, so that essential work does not continue to be this temporary go-to system that the government invokes when it is in danger, but it becomes the organizing principle for social life going forward. So workers who have to staff essential services like nurses, supermarket staff, street cleaners, and others should be paid extra during these times. They're risking their and their family's health. You know, they should be getting pandemic pay. But even after the pandemic passes, we have to think about why then they suddenly get pushed down the social ladder and their work re-devalued. We also have to demand, for instance, very simple things like the nationalization of all private hospitals. This is something Spain did on a temporary basis, thus admitting in general that private healthcare is unable to save lives. But we must demand that such moves become universal and permanent, especially in the United States, where, you know, even someone with a stable university professorial job like myself, I have to think twice about going to the doctor. I can't afford to make what I, in my mind, call frivolous visits because it costs me so much money. You know, my deductible, I have to think about what my ultimate out-of-pocket expense is. So $10,000 is my usual out-of-pocket expense per year on healthcare. So any visit up to $10,000, I have to pay for myself. And I have one of the best healthcare insurances in the country, right? So this kind of a system during a pandemic is not just insane, it is criminal. So this is something that we have to think about when we say, you know, yes, I'm glad you value essential work, but now you have to walk the walk to make that essential work available and honored for the vast majority. What about simple things like free laptops and Wi-Fi at home and free lunch programs for all students when schools close? Free childcare for parents who have to work. These are very, very basic demands that we must say must be installed during the pandemic, but must be sustained even after. And this is why I'm so eager and excited to hear about Marguerite's campaign about, you know, making space for childcare in Amsterdam. Lastly, I think we have to insist that there be no deportations or immigration raids during and after the pandemic. During the lockdown in the spring, Ireland had put up a firewall between access to healthcare and immigration. This temporarily allowed undocumented people to access healthcare and welfare without fear of arrests, detention, or deportation. That gives us an idea of what is possible. If they can do it during so-called wartime, why can't that be made permanent? Only capitalism, I feel, could have invented a phrase, social isolation or social distance, to deal with this crisis. From a system that thrives on alienation and atomization, this should come as no surprise. But we have to be calling for, yes, physical isolation, but social solidarity. That's our way to deal with this pandemic, you know. For in these ruinous times, there still were and are acts of anti-capitalism. entire regions devised novel ways to thank their healthcare workers. This was not, your clap for NHS coming from Boris Johnson. This was spontaneous acts of solidarity coming from ordinary people recognizing and celebrating their healthcare workers. Educators offered free online lessons, counselors free help for mental health, those who need mental health care. This instinct for care and solidarity is what makes us human, and we cannot let capitalism make us forget that. We are creating beauty even when our surroundings have been vandalized by profit. So this crisis, beyond the shadow of a doubt, has shown us that it is care work that makes all work possible. Our job now is to ensure that all politics become the politics of care. While we help each other through this crisis, let us also then plan our future. Yes, we have to physically isolate ourselves, but we need to politically isolate those forces that continue to devalue care work and value thing-making over life-making. We have to fight like hell for a society that values life-making over profit-making. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this, Tithi. Marguerite, I am going to give the floor to you for whatever you want to pick up and engage with, but I also know that you prepared some of your own reflections, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for these very important remarks. It's such an urgent agenda that we're discussing here. I'm very honored to be responding here. I have a couple of things prepared, but I also have some questions to use to open up a conversation. So that I think is the best way to go about it. I have something to say about what we called in the Netherlands vital professions in this spring. So that's a slightly different term. I have something to say about grief and love and refusal. I will see where we go from there. So in the spring in the Netherlands, very early on, the Dutch universities and their association were successful in lobbying in defining university staff as a vital profession, as part of the vital professions. And so this meant, and Sarah already explained this a little bit, that we could still use childcare services and we could send our children to school if we wanted to. And some were very grateful because we were all in a time crunch and there was a lot of work and we had to do the care work at home in the lockdown. But then some of us, myself included, refused to categorize as a vital profession at this time, so as not to put pressure on the already, very much pressured public infrastructures and health in ways that we felt was irresponsible. So I think what this example shows us here is there are two meanings of the word vital here, I think. So one of the things is how we were vital was that we were supposed to make sure that business as usual in universities could continue. And so the thing to keep alive here, if we take this meaning of vital literally, was the economy and the order of things, right? What I think also important here is that vital meant at this time, not necessarily life-making work, as you call it, but to have access to that life-making work, right? So it was really a demand, because if I'm teaching, that's not necessarily life-making work, at least it's not important life-making work in the middle of a pandemic. But defining me as part of these vital professions does give me access to the actual life-making work of others, right? With all the threats that entailed. So we were, we were in place to make sure that the credential factory of the university would run smoothly, really. And we were asked to do Zoom lectures and knowledge clips. So just for context, Dutch universities are public. So we have a very different university system, I think, than in a lot of places. And so most are publicly financed as well. And And then we've been asked, at least this semester, to provide what is called hybrid teaching, which involves both online and on-campus activities. But many students, especially second and first year and third year students, don't actually come to campus for training right now. So this spring and this summer was spent on making sure that we could actually do some form of teaching this fall. And then last week, this is an anecdote, but I think it's very telling. Last week, on September 11, almost two weeks after the opening of the academic year here in the Netherlands, the rectors, the management of universities in the Netherlands, made a public statement that it is not good education that we're able to offer at this time. We're not offering good teaching because we're unable to do this in real life. And so we need more room and we need more space to maneuver to actually offer teaching in real life. And I thought we should note this timing, that 2 weeks after the actual opening of the academic year, this acknowledgement was given, right? So I had spent, and many people with me, I had spent most of my spring semester and much of my summer actually planning this teaching that all of us knew wouldn't actually be possible, right? To do teaching over Zoom, because for teaching, it's just so important to have this real life contact. And instead of acknowledging this early on and act accordingly, this acknowledgement came 2 weeks after all of us having started. And so, so they waited until everyone was enrolled in their program and we had our students, and so the university system wouldn't collapse. And actually now we have many more students than we had anticipated. To acknowledge that this is not working. And I think at this time, this takes too much toll on our students, but also on staff. And so that I thought was important to say. But since some of my students are watching, I'm sure, and Sarah's students as well, it's important for me to say that. So I love to teach, right? This is why I'm in this job. So I think it's important what we teach, also in this very crazy time. And I'm sure that we'll manage and we'll make something good out of this mess. It's what we do. So we'll make sure to do that. But this love of this job and these feelings of responsibility are also precisely what make our work, but also the essential work that you just mentioned, so very vulnerable. I think we're asked to love our jobs and to have passion there and to love the people for whom we work, whether it's our patients or our students or whatever. And this creates a kind of a bind for us, I think. Because as Sarah Jaffe would say, this is the title of her new book, work won't love you back, right? This is the bind, I think. And we most certainly know that universities won't and don't. So that's one thing about the kind of work that we do and the vital professions discussion. I think it's also good to say something about just how quick we were this spring in sacrificing other workers at the university for this goal, right? So one of the first things that stood out to me in the very first crisis emails was the assurance in many of these emails that coffee machines would remain working and that the offices would still be cleaned, right? And so I immediately asked, well, who's doing this then, right? So it's so important for me to access my office and my coffee machine. And so then at the height of this pandemic, someone has to come in and actually clean this and stock it and so on. So at that time, we were really sort of this shelter in place class that was very happy to sacrifice others in doing this. So cleaners, waiters, delivery people, women and men of color, essentially. And so for me, this pandemic was a lot about questions of precarity and precariousness. And so while we're all vulnerable, I think in this, and just because we have bodies and we see this, especially in a pandemic, right? We can all become sick. I like Judith Butler's conceptualization of precarity, which is the hierarchization of this vulnerability, right? So there's a political distribution of who is more vulnerable and who's protected and so on. And this is racialized and gendered, right? And we saw this very, very starkly, I think, in this moment. So there's a distribution of vulnerability and of death here. And a distribution of who deserves care. and who is cared for. But importantly, I think also who dies first, right? So I think very sadly, what we saw in this pandemic, I'm not familiar with the situation about this in the US, but in the Netherlands, hardly any grieving took place. So it seems like the lives that were lost in this pandemic of workers and also elderly people were not really considered grievable loss somehow. So this caused a lot of sadness in many, I think in me in any case. And I think in many calculations of the government, it was even, so the lives that were lost were just collateral. It was just, calculated in the models. And I was just amazed, about the way in which, hardly any questions were asked about the way in which the elderly were in fact not protected in this crisis. It's very clear now that this is precisely what we did not do. And the way also, for example, you mentioned the detention centers. Those in detention in general were very badly protected, but also those in detention centers for migrants. In the Netherlands, there wasn't even soap in the detention centers, right? So the very, very basic necessities in the middle of this pandemic were not provided. And we really haven't started talking about this yet, I think. And the Dutch generally just haven't really started talking about who died and started grieving yet. No collective rituals. We don't even have the statistics, to talk about who died and who did not, to determine who were. So the idea is so pervasive that this virus is so democratic, and the Dutch like to pride ourselves on this egalitarianism and so on. But we forget about precarity in the sense of distribution of vulnerability. And so these lives are just not grievable. So to my knowledge, we don't know really in the Netherlands who died, while in the UK, to my understanding, there have actually been reports about the NHS healthcare workers that died, and and who these people were, and who was unprotected and who was not. So yeah, all of this leads me to want to talk about refusal, I guess. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the kinds of refusals that are possible at this time. Because yes, I think we need to make demands to our governments, but we are also at a time when it seems that our governments or states have turned their backs on publics in important ways. This is part of what we see in these new elaborations of solidarity, I think, that in the absence of the state actually taking up this role, publics start doing this themselves. But refusal, so essential workers, or that workers that are necessary for our health, for nurturing, care, reproduction. So are often in this bind, right? So we love our work and we love the people for whom we do this work. And so refusing to do this work feels like an abandonment, right? Of the people for whom we do this, for whom we care. So I draw inspiration here. There are many things, but one of the inspirations here is this manifesto of the Wages Against Housework, right? It's not for nothing that it was called the Wages Against Housework. The whole point was not to have to do this housework in the same way anymore, right? So they demanded wages in order for there to be a wage relation, a power relation, so that they could refuse this work of reproduction. And so that they would also be in a position to go on strike. And it was absolutely clear this spring for university workers, but for real essential workers across the economy, that it was very difficult to actually refuse work and go on strike. And it's, this is also a time, I think, when it's difficult to organize effective collective action. So I'd be interested in learning from you what you see as inspiring examples also of refusals of work and how we could go about that kind of organization. Yeah, I'll end there.
Thank you, Marguerite. And I think strike is high on the agenda now, but I'm giving the floor to Tithi, to whatever you want to engage with.
No, I'll say a few words, but I would love to hear from you as well, Sarah, what you think of, because that refusal piece that Marguerite you raised is so vital right now to talk about. So I would like to hear from you all as well. So I have two quick thoughts, I think. First of all, thank you for sharing your experience and for doing this work while dealing with everything else in your life and work. I want to talk about the love question a little bit because, I'm sure you're familiar with Nancy Folbert's work, and she's a feminist economist, and she calls it, I forget the exact term, but I think she calls it a love tax, that sometimes it's really hard to organize care workers because they are taking care of the most vulnerable of populations. And so, for them to go on strike is really tough because, as you said, it becomes a question of, sort of abandonment, and their going on strike seems even to themselves as selfish, right? So we can't really do this. So I think that's a very, very crucial challenge that care workers, and particularly women care workers, constantly have to negotiate, and women workers in general. Even when teachers and professors go on strike, we are called greedy and we're not taking care of the needs of our children. So there's that side of it. And the other thing is, we have seen unbelievable love flourish during the pandemic, in our mutual aid networks. My favorite example has been Italians singing to each other across their balconies, and Palestinian farmers leaving food, free agricultural products for folks to just take by the roadside. Those two were like my favorite examples. But both of these issues, us doing this work, doing waged work out of care, and mutual aid networks, which is unwaged labor done out of care, I think both of these are important pieces because both of these are actually weaponized by capitalism and the government to keep production running, right? So this is not just something that is left to its own devices. This has a practical application, right? So I, as a social reproduction feminist, absolutely celebrate mutual aid networks. But the other part of me says, well, we shouldn't have to do this. This is the task of governments. That's why we are paying taxes, that why should Palestinian farmers have to leave food for hungry folks? This is something the government should be organizing. Why should low-wage care workers who are nursing aides, who 90% of nursing aides, folks who work in the nursing aid profession in the US, 90% of them are women, and 1/3 of them are women of color, okay? So why should they have to decide between striking and caring for their clients? So this human capacity to love each other and love our jobs is often weaponized or commercialized by capitalism, and we should be aware of that. And this is where refusal, I think, is a crucial tool, where we say that the refusal is not a refusal of love, but the refusal is actually to overcome the weaponization of love, right? So I think, one of the fantastic things that struck me when this explosion, a necessary, urgent explosion of anti-police violence exploded across the US, during the pandemic. Initially people were like, oh, look at all these people, they're not scared. They're now spreading the virus by going on these massive demonstrations and so on. And it struck me that only someone who had not experienced the brutality of racism in the US could say something like that, because the people who were protesting, and I say these were large multiracial protests, you know, white anti-racists joined shoulder to shoulder with Black and Latino comrades protesting. People who were protesting acts and institutions which were causing them harm constantly, even beyond the pandemic, and had actually exacerbated the effects of the pandemic. The pandemic, we know, has, in the US anyway, there are actually numbers that disproportionately affected Black and Latino communities, like burned like wildfire through these communities, right? So they were protesting categories that were making them unsafe. They had no choice, you know, we had no choice. So there, I think, again, was an act of refusal, you know, there, which was refuse to take the government's word for granted that some justice would come for the murder of George Floyd or Breonna Taylor. This refusal was a refusal of love, that, you know, we are taking this risk in pandemic times because we don't want to die during normal times, right? So I think we have to think about it in that particular way, love and prioritizing love, not in the short term of how the government or capitalism wants us to think, but love as a long-term project of social solidarity, for which sometimes we need refusal in order to get there. So that's how I would connect the two very important categories you raised, Marguerite.
Mm. Yeah, nothing. Sarah?
I mean, I was just thinking a small thought. I was thinking of the words, right? Like, so love and then weaponized. Tithi, you used the word to weaponize that love. And it struck me that a word that I would come to my mind would be that the love is vampirized. Is that a word? No, is that, because there's an interest in, you know, fostering lots of that love, right? Because it keeps life making going, it keeps society going, and then sucking, you know, the profit out of it, sucking the life out of it. So it's almost like it's, I don't know, yeah, weaponized is another kind of idea, but I see the vampire at work, let's put it like that. And I think there's that, you know, the vampiring of the love. And another category that I find that it also figures in all of this, and that's then more individual, is that of resilience, right? We also want all these individuals, neoliberal ideology, we need all of us to be resilient, which the resilience is also vampirized, if that is the word. I don't think it is. So that were just two things that came to mind. But I see that we have, so I'm slowly going to open in Q&A, but still give you the floor, Marguerite. But I see there is a question that actually, Tithi, I think you touched upon some of it, but it could kind of extend what you were just saying. So I'm going to read out the question by Natalia Flores. Tithi, could you please elaborate a little about how to make life-making activities a collective thing? So not privatized, not individualized, and especially how to place that responsibility outside of the family. And so how to start criticizing the institution of the family when the pandemic did the opposite. It strengthened in many ways the idea that taking care of others is something that the family should do. And by saying the family, we are saying mostly women in the family. Mothers, sisters, grandmothers have organized their lives in these months to take care of others. So we're kind of adding to the conversation the category of the family. So I don't know if Tithi, you first want to comment on that, and Marguerite, if you want to follow up.
Marguerite, I'm happy for Marguerite to go.
Yeah.
First. Yeah.
Okay, so this is an excellent question. To me, so something that comes to mind for me is what Tithi called the spaces of life making, right? So I think one of the things in which we can make this life making work more collective is to think about different architectures, actually. because the kind of housing we now have, which is, you know, most housing, especially in inner city neighborhoods, is too poor on many counts, but it also is very deeply isolating, right? Because it's usually family housing. And I think there are ways of thinking about housing that can far more easily sort of accommodate sharing caring roles and sharing life-making work. There are many reasons to do this, by the way. Also, you know, reasons of global warming. It's a very strange moment in time, actually, when we all have our own separate kitchens and our own separate everything to clean and so on. So I think there's something to be done there. And the way in which so shelter in place became the household, and then in the Netherlands, this was made very, very specific. So households weren't just people that live together, which would have sort of made sense, at least in the, you know, the pandemic logic. But it was made very clear that people that live together in the family form would qualify as a household for, you know, all of the laws that were in place for public space. So, for example, our students sometimes were fined for actually eating together in their home. So their household, you know, their housemates, but weren't recognized as a household there. So this was a very deeply heteronormative norm of what a household is and what the space of shelter and protection could be. And of course, for many people, but this has been said so many times, but still, I feel it's important to say that for many people, the household is, of course, not a space of safety, but a space of violence, right? And then all of a sudden, work needed to take place there as well. So I think actually one of the things that we haven't really thought about so much, or that's less on the agenda, is ways in which we can create architectures and forms of housing, spaces of life making, let's say, that offer us the infrastructure actually to do that work more collectively.
Thanks, Margaret. I mean, I completely agree. And I would just start with something perhaps more, a little stark, that I am not committed to the bourgeois family. And I think the sooner we get rid of it, the happier we will be. Right now, I think the problem is that our sense of love has been anchored in the bourgeois family, but actually people love way beyond the bourgeois family, even now, even while the bourgeois heteronormative family is considered the ideal. Most people go way beyond that, you know, sort of prescribed ideal and love in all kinds of different ways. The bourgeois family is supposed to be the heteronormative father, mother, and child, and doggy and kitty, but people have all kinds of family arrangements, and actually under neoliberalism, more and more diverse family kind of arrangements, because it's impossible to maintain childcare and elder care with just mama, papa, and you know, 2 children. So people actually live a life that is far more generative, creative than the bourgeois heteronormative ideal. But it is the heteronormative bourgeois family ideal, as Marguerite pointed out, that is recognized as the social unit for love and care. And so that is a problem in itself, that this is a real basic problem. And so we have to question the family. But we also have to understand that the family, like many other institutions under capitalism, play a double role. On the one hand, it is the heart of a heartless world, okay? Because in a society that does not provide any kind of avenues for love, care, where any sort of sense is not provided by the government and other infrastructures, the family is the place where, after a long days of work, you come back to rest, where the child comes back to be loved by the mother or the caregiver, and so on. And elder cares workers who are retired find solace in that space. So there is that point about the heart of a heartless world. But on the other hand, it is also the heartless space in an equally heartless world. It is the space for domestic violence, it is the space for sexual abuse, it is the space where genderqueer identities are often broken and told that they are not essential to the making of their own world, right? So it functions as this doubled space, which does both things at the same time. So when we say that as feminists and queer activists, we want the abolition of the family, one might say, well, then where are we going to, find solace? Where are we going to find rest? And this is why I think it's very important that we talk about alternatives to the bourgeois heteronormative family, not alternatives to love and take care of each other, right? So we are protesting the structure of the bourgeois normative family, not protesting the human being's ability to love, to have sex, and to care for our children in non-oppressive ways. That is something we actually want more of, right? I mean, I am the mother of a girl entering teenagehood, and I have made it a point in recent times to talk to her more about the pleasures of sex, because I felt that from age 7 to about age 12, I concentrated on making her aware of the dangers of sexual abuse, right? So, what is acceptable, in terms of bodily intimacy and, how to recognize these signs. And then I thought to myself, oh my Lord, I am bringing up a kid without, sort of communicating to her the pleasures and wonders of sex. And so I try now, in age-appropriate ways to kind of remind her of that it is not just about, don't come any closer, this is my personal space. It is not just about inappropriate touching. It is also about appropriate touching and loving, So as feminists, when we say we want the abolition of family, we're not talking about the abolition of love. We are in fact talking about the ability to love in deeper and more meaningful ways that is impeded by the bourgeois heteronormative family. And so I think the point about domestic violence cannot be underestimated, particularly during pandemic times, okay, when folks were sheltering in place, right? So in every country on record that I have looked up, it has seen an escalation of domestic violence. Every single country where numbers have been kept, okay? And even domestic violence shelters have been closed down during the pandemic. So in other words, it was a complete pressure cooker for folks that they couldn't escape their homes because the normal avenues where they would escape to were sort of closed off. So I think we should be talking more about the problems of individual bourgeois heteronormative families so far, and we should talk about the joys of loving one another in multiple kinship network ways.
Yeah, kinship making, alternative kinship making. There's more questions coming up, and one of them going back to the strike, which I also want to get back to, but there's a question first and then we get to the strike. And this is by Floris de Krijger. How does the gendered and racialized nature of what you call spaces of life making impact the productive sphere, wage labor? What are the reasons for emphasizing the gendered and racialized nature of the former sphere of capitalism and not the later?
That's a very interesting question. Well, maybe I didn't emphasize it here, but this is, okay, so let me try to say this. First of all, I think there is a recognition in mainstream sociological literature, in mainstream understanding, that the workplace is racialized, right? We know, for instance, it is accepted somewhat that the labor market is deeply segregated, that Black workers, I'm only talking about India and the US, the two countries I know best, right? So Black workers in the US, Dalit workers in India earn less than upper caste workers or white workers, okay? So this is something that is kind of accepted. I'm not saying by accepted, I don't mean enjoyed. I'm saying that it is actually there in the mainstream discourse, in wage differential, in government publication. This understanding exists. What does not exist is the relationship between racial segregation in the non-work area, how that produces racial segregation in the workplace, right? So that's the conduit, the analytical conduit that does not exist that I'm trying to emphasize here, which is why when I mention that, you know, Black neighborhoods are hotter, or Black neighborhoods have the worst waste-making factories, or schools in Black neighborhoods close down faster than schools in you know, white neighborhoods. What that means is not just that the immediate lives of people in these neighborhoods are affected. What it means is the lifetime chances of these people are affected. So the kind of jobs they get, the kind of training they receive in these schools, which allow them to get the kind of jobs, actually determine that they get low wage jobs, you know. So that connection is what I'm trying to emphasize, that we can't just say that the workplace creates labor segregation and creates racial disparities. That's a fact that's accepted. We just have to, my job, I feel, is to draw that connection between the non-workplace spaces where the Black worker is produced differently than the white worker. And only then does he or she become the Black worker to get that low wage, if that explains it.
Yes, thank you. The two next questions, both in a different way, move in the direction of action, right? Strike and what can we do, forms of action. So I'm going to read both of them, and I think both of you can comment on whatever elements in both questions you want to pick up on. The first question is by Peter Drucker, a question for Tithi. The word strike has already fallen in this discussion, and I know that before the pandemic you wrote and spoke about the teacher strikes in the US and the alliances between teachers, pupils, parents, and communities that made those strikes so powerful. Do you see lessons now for organizing of care workers in the pandemic? And does this have implications for your understanding of care work? And are there issues to negotiate in alliances between care workers and the cared for? So that is one question. And then the second question about forms of action is by Annelies Moors. And I just want to wave hi to Annelies Moors. Thanks for a great talk. I agree with the ways in which love is weaponized by capital and the state. Yet there seems to me also a tension with the risk then of commodifying all relations, with not longer celebrating our sense of humanity. That is, how to think about a refusal to strike if this would be so harmful for highly vulnerable people. Should we not devise other forms of action?
Do you want to go, Marguerite? I just finished talking. I want...
No, I'm absolutely fine with you starting with this. Yeah.
Are you sure? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, Peter, hi. Nice to have you here, and thank you for asking that question. Yes, I do. I mean, I think, you know, right now as we speak, the Illinois Nurses Association is on strike against the hospital administration for cuts in their services, and the fact that all of these cuts will actually affect disproportionately Black neighborhoods, right? So the nurses are on, there is a nurses strike going on right now. There is a graduate student strike going on right now in the University of Michigan, which is, they're calling it wonderfully an abolitionist strike. So they're saying that we want our campuses to be safe, not just protected against the virus, but also the police have to go off campus because that's what really makes campuses safe. So it's a protection against both cops and COVID. So what I think you're asking, though, a deeper question, and I want some time to think about it. You're asking the question that it seems to me that now that essential work has been recognized or care work has been recognized, does it give us more potential for this kind of work to have the power to disrupt the workings of capitalism, right? Now that we know nurses are really essential for creating society, does this give nurses some kind of leverage to be able to say, we will strike and we'll see how you carry on, right? So, and I wish I had the answer to that, but I do think the answer I do have is that there is a growing consciousness. There is a growing consciousness in at least the US labor force about the necessity of care work and essential work. And I do think that in the long run, unless we are crushed by the US government, as the government will try to do, and I want to emphasize here, whether it's the Democratic president or the Republican to crush social protest, I do think that we will see in the coming years more strikes in the care sector. That said, I want to go back and say, actually, some of the first wave of strikes against neoliberalism and austerity came from the care sector. So when I was writing and talking to striking teachers in the US teacher strike got a lot of press, and rightly so, but it was going on at the same time as teacher strikes in multiple countries at that time. So, and the nurses have been most militant in the US as well. So I think there is a growing consciousness, especially in the in women in these industries and in these care industries in particular, that our work is important and that we have some leverage now. So I am very hopeful. I'm also very hopeful how these industries are questioning non-wage related forms of oppression. So for instance, nurses have been in the forefront in recent years in coming to the anti-racist protests. Nurses have been in the forefront caring for those who have been pepper sprayed and fired at during the anti-racist protests. So these are moments, key moments of radicalization of workers in these industries and sectors that I think are going to be our resources of hope in the coming days.
Marguerite, do you want to also think about the other forms of action?
It's such a difficult question, right? So when there's really no comparing, I think, the kind of the work of nurses in the Netherlands and in the US, right? So I think the situation of workers in the Netherlands is a very different one. But there was a demand made right after the pandemic, and that said, well, we want more than the applause, right? We want higher wages for this very important work that we've been doing, and especially those workers that actually were at the intensive care centers and so on, said, well, we've been to a very, very difficult time now, and we want some acknowledgement for this, but also higher wages. And this is a political battle now also in Parliament here. But in the instances where I saw associations of nurses, but I may be mistaken, I haven't really sort of tracked all of this. Responses were very much like, disappointment, but also immediately saying, well, we are very disappointed that we will not get this acknowledgement at this time, but we will be there if a new wave of this pandemic hits us, right? So this is this bind that I meant before. So we've seen an increase in strike in the Netherlands in recent years as well, but I'd be surprised if this pandemic, mobilizes this at this time. At the same time, it does everyone is very keenly aware of just how essential their work is at this time, perhaps more so than before.
I thought just to add a little thing, I thought the Chicago Teachers Union, which went on strike for the first time in 2013, yes, 2013, I think, and it was a really, really important strike because no one was striking at that time, and it was a strike that won against a Democrat mayor in a major city in the U.S. The Chicago Teachers Union devised a slogan that I thought really spoke to this dilemma of, should we strike because then we would be abandoning our caring duties towards our students and so on. So they said, our working conditions are our students' learning conditions, right? So they connected the two in that way. And, from then on, that approach have been used also by nurses when they have struck. That the reason we're striking is because we cannot care adequately for our patients in the circumstances you have provided. So again, we are refusing to love better, not refusing to love, so we're refusing so we may love better is the sort of framework. So I thought that was very useful, the way the CTU, the Chicago Teachers Union, framed it.
Yeah, I think also, if I may briefly add, Sarah, to this, I think also that there's a number of places where a rent strike would be in order at this time, right? So we can also have strikes beyond the workplace, I think. So, there are social housing sectors in the Netherlands and places where rents have gone up so much that at the same time, when unemployment is rising so much in this particular situation, it's just that people are not capable of paying these rents anymore. And sometimes this is actually even the case because of the housing associations engaging a couple of years ago in all kinds of speculation on financial markets, right? And the price is very directly paid by the people that need to pay these higher rents. So that to me would be a very good point of entry in this too.
Yeah, I am looking at the time and thinking about needing to wrap up soon. I still have one question, and if there are any burning questions, I would invite people in the audience to write them now while I'm reading the one question that I have. This is a question from Sophie Silverstein. Hi, I have a question for Tithi. At the beginning of her talk, she pointed out how governments defining a category of essential work shines new light on the importance of certain forms of reproductive labor. Can you comment on the potential and risks or limitations of the government, at least temporarily allocating more resources and taking responsibility for productive labor? How does the way it allows reproduction beyond the nuclear family, and as you already said, beyond mutual aid balance against the risk of reaffirming forms of oppression that allocated reproductive responsibilities in unequal ways to begin with? And if I may, or what I read into this is indeed like the demands on the government, but if governments such as some governments that we have in our country take control over the question of reproductive labor, not in the feminist terms that we are developing here, we're running into other kind of trouble. So I hope, Sophia, I am not massacring your question, but that's one of the things that I read into it. What are the risks, the potentials, but also the risks of the government taking over the responsibility for reproductive labor?
Thank you for asking that question, Sophie. And I have a horrific example to share with you to answer that. Yesterday, actually 2 days ago, a healthcare worker, a nurse, a Black nurse, first raised the alarm bells that immigrant women were being given forced hysterectomies in detention centers. So ICE agents, which is immigration officers, were disproportionately operating on immigrant women and giving them hysterectomies. So this is, you know, a stark kind of an example. And this is not the first time in the US, as, you know, all feminists in the US know, you know, the cases of mass sterilization conducted by governments. So this is a very recent and clear example of the dangers that perhaps you are, you know, sort of asking us to be alert towards, and I fully agree. So my sort of limited response to that is that I think any kind of, that's where I started, that any kind of government definition, such as the government's definition of essential work, government's definition of what reproductive health is, I think we should be very, very wary of and critical of, right? It is our job to, again, fill these hollow categories with feminist definitions, right? The categories themselves are kind of meaningless when it comes from the sort of organizers of capitalist violence, okay? So our job is to kind of fill these categories with feminist definitions. So how do we emphasize, you know, first of all, I think we should say that domestic labor, the family unit, as it were, needs to be emptied out of domestic labor, right? So more public laundries, more public places for food production, right? Right now we do have, I always say this, right? We do have public kitchens, but they're only for the rich. They're called restaurants, right? So we want them for everybody so that food making for our loved ones becomes a choice for us rather than a constant drudgery and necessity. You know, the communists are not coming for our private kitchens, right? It's just that the feminists are saying private kitchens are as Marguerite pointed out, environmentally makes no sense, but also, you know, just in terms of rationality makes no sense. I mean, they're great if you want to cook once in a while for your loved ones, but otherwise there should be public kitchens that we can access food from. So I think while we demand that more government resources come towards social reproductive services, we also need to continue to talk about how social reproduction and the notions of social reproduction cannot be anchored to just the bourgeois heteronormative family and the dangers of that. And I think in recent times, queer activists and trans activists have really done all of us a great political service by drawing attention to the violence and the oppression of the sort of heteronormative family unit. And I think we owe these comrades a debt of gratitude for clarifying for us how love can be de-anchored from these spaces and redistributed in other forms of kinship making.
Marguerite, do you want to say your last words?
Well, I think we can, we should maybe look at the state, but we can also start now together in doing some of these things, right? So I think that's one of the lessons I also draw from this pandemic, that there's an awful lot that we can actually do together. based on love, right? And I think so. So yeah, I wouldn't wait for the government. I would see what we can elaborate together. Yeah.
Well, if I may interpret it, Marguerite, what we can do together and then build the infrastructures, right?
Right.
And in a sense, the government is also a kind of infrastructure. Like, so, I mean, there's a link between government and infrastructures, but we can also build infrastructures. And
yeah.
On that note, I really want to thank both Tithi and Marguerite for this first session of trying to think through some of the crises. It is something that we will continue to do throughout the year. Also very much hoping that we can build further on these conversations, dreaming that there will be a moment soon that we can bring all of these thinkers who help us to think through the crisis physically together. That's a dream for now. But in any case, thank you very much, Tithi. Thank you very much, Marguerite. And thank you to the audience for being with us, staying with us, and for all the engaging questions. And if you want to watch the lecture again, or the conversation again, or know about the following events that also in the series of Thinking Through the Crisis that ArcGIS will organize, I will refer you to our website. So that was it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.